to do today is to talk a bit about some of the changes that have emerged in the lives of ordinary North Koreans, and where those come from in terms of changes to the state's approach to the political economy of North Korea. And so I wanted to start by introducing a concept called market Leninism that I believe has increasingly come to characterize North Korea's political economy. I should probably note here that there's an article that lays out some of these arguments, although not all of what I'm about to say today, on the development of market Leninism under Kim Jong-un in North Korea, that was co-authored with one of my PhD students, Benjamin Katz of Silverstein, and so I just want to make sure that he's properly credited for being a co-author on parts of what I'm about to say today. So the idea behind the concept of market Leninism in North Korea is that Pyongyang has responded to a set of changes that have unfolded in North Korea since the 1990s that scholars have characterized as marketization from below. And marketization from below has to do with the loss of state control, the collapse of the public distribution system during the arduous march, the loss of control over strictures on internal mobility, and the rise of grassroots black or gray markets, both within North Korea itself and across the river border with northeastern China, in particular with the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture. And so market Leninism emerges from the idea that faced with several decades of marketization from below that threatened to erode state control over economic activity and over the revenue that it generated, that Pyongyang responded to that marketization from below with a set of policy changes aimed at combining market activity with enhanced political control. This has really been a development that we've seen most sort of cohesively emerge or most strongly emerge, although it has emerged gradually and piecemeal during the period of Kim Jong-un's time in power. And so it really is a Kim Jong-un era phenomenon. So that we're really, focused on the changes that have rolled out over the course of the last decade. The way I see the goal of the market Leninist framework that North Korea has adopted is that Pyongyang is seeking to institutionalize a subset of market practices, those that are acceptable to the regime. I'll come back to that in a moment. So to institutionalize acceptable market practices within a strong political and ideological framework that stabilizes and strengthens single-party rule, so rule by Kim Jong-un at the head of the Korean Workers' Party. And there's been some good scholarship looking at how Kim Jong-un, in both preparing for succession and in the time since he's been in the leadership role, has reinvigorated the party as a complement to the military first politics, and in some ways to weaken a bit the military first politics that characterized North Korea under Kim Jong-il. So this makes North Korea a bit more like China and Vietnam today than Soviet or European communism of the late Cold War. And I say that because there's often a tendency in North Korean studies, for really valid and useful reasons, to focus on comparing North Korea to its Stalinist or its at least Soviet comparator. And what we see is happening, particularly under Kim Jong-il, is this shift toward a model that is the one that we see unfolding with different constraints and conditions in contemporary China and in contemporary Vietnam. Most of the work on China refers to this as party-state capitalism. So you can kind of pick your term. Both that and market Leninism refer to this combination of institutionalized market practices with strong political control. And so in the North Korean case, some of the key moments in the development of this on the economic side were the June 28th and the May 30th measures, which occurred in 2012 and 2014. North Korea also has adapted and redeployed 5-year economic plans. It had one in 2016 and another in 2021. And revisions to the enterprise law, which occurred primarily in 2020, as well as some changes to the way that special economic zones are both sort of promoted and employed in the overall fabric of the DPRK's political economy. As it relates to political control, the key sort of steps that Kim Jong-un has taken to strengthen political control have to do with the law on reactionary ideology, which formally has a bit longer and more cumbersome name, but which was updated in 2020 and 2022. Broader campaigns against foreign media, including even, I think last week I was reading a set of reports coming out of North Korea, all of which are very hard to verify, but reports of execution of a relatively large number of young people for consumption of foreign media that had been provided or circulated by defector groups that are based in South Korea. Another feature of the push toward tightened political control is an anti-corruption campaign. And this is actually a really interesting feature of Kim Jong-un's governance that I don't think has received a lot of attention outside of very specific academic circles. There's a really fantastic book by scholar Chris Carruthers on corruption control in authoritarian regimes that goes back and actually unpacks some of the ways in which Kim Jong-un's anti-corruption campaigns parallel some of the anti-corruption campaigns that were deployed by Kim Il-sung. So the use of purges as a tool of political control, but also more broadly, the use of anti-corruption to try to crack down on officials from the most senior levels of the Korean Workers' Party and the military all the way down to more reports of more local inspections at the provincial or the city level. And, this has obviously unfolded in a decade in which China has also drawn much more global attention for its own anti-corruption campaigns and crackdowns. But again, that's an area where North Korea's focus on anti-corruption campaigns as a tool of political control parallel probably contemporary China and now Vietnam, where we have a series of very high-profile anti-corruption investigations unfolding at present. And certainly that's another data point that suggests that China and Vietnam are appropriate comparators. We actually know from the comparative politics literature that countries, that diffusion of policy ideas and of regime features tends to occur not just geographically, but among clusters or networks of regimes of similar type. And so it's not surprising in some ways that North Korea, China, and Vietnam, as Leninist regimes and regimes that are characterized by Communist Party rule and strong leadership at the top, might adopt some of these similar features. So that's a sort of a known finding in the comparative authoritarian literature that there's diffusion not just among geography but among regime subtypes, and so that sort of strengthens the prior that we might have that North Korea, China, and Vietnam might pursue parallel or similar policy tracks and might more easily learn from each other because it's easier to apply lessons if a regime is more similar to one's own, if you are an autocrat. And then the final feature of political control has to do with border controls, especially under COVID. The North Korean regime had a very strong justification on public health grounds to really enhance border controls and border security in ways that decimated the number of North Koreans who were able to cross the border and make their way to South Korea during that time. The market Leninism arose because the regime in Pyongyang had a set of problems that had emerged from marketization from below that it needed to solve politically in order to feel like it had a handle on political stability and political control for the regime, for the regime's sake. So, the first of these is that marketization and the development of black and gray markets and cross-border trade with China, licit and illicit, and everything in between, produced a mismatch between the economic status of citizens and the political status of citizens. And North Korea, we all know, is extraordinarily politically hierarchical in terms of its designation of citizens into a set of political classes. But marketization from below brought the emergence of a set of nouveau riche citizens who had made money from trade and been able to survive, even economically maybe flourish, who had different interests in the political and economic order than the sort of local party cadres, who often were slower to participate in market activity, especially in the early years of marketization from below. And so there you have, political interests and economic interests not aligned, and the risk that an entrepreneurial middle class or an entrepreneurial class of some kind will emerge as a force of either local or even more broad opposition to the regime and its policies. Marketization from below also produced a loss of the ability to collect revenue. Previously, North Korea depended on a model of revenue generation where the state monopolized the assets used to produce revenue and had mechanisms by which it could capture that revenue at the point either of origin or when it entered North Korea from abroad. And so marketization from below eroded the ability to capture that revenue. It also produced a growing information asymmetry in citizens' favor and against the regime, or maybe again, eroded the information dominance of the North Korean regime for a time, as citizens could hide and did hide that black market economic activity from the state, especially at higher levels. And then it created some principal agent problems with respect to local officials, who benefited in many cases economically from turning a blind eye and forbearing on enforcing some of the directives to crack down on market activity that might be coming from Pyongyang at various points. So I raise this because market Leninism as a set of policy responses, I think, took steps to address each of these problems. And so I'll go through each of those in turn, and then I'll wrap up and turn to questions and discussion. First, the changes in things like the measures that were adopted in 2012 and 2014, as well as those related to the special economic zones, tended to increase enterprise-level autonomy somewhat, not to the extent that we've seen in China, for example, or even in parts of Vietnam's reforms, but did increase enterprise-level autonomy in both industry and agriculture, and created some incentives for production by shifting the balance so that citizens or enterprises were able to keep a larger portion of the revenue or the product that they generated. And so that shifted the incentives somewhat and allowed citizens to benefit from these new regulations that the regime was imposing. It also formalized governance of black market activity that was largely ungoverned and or illicit. And formalizing previously black market activity had a couple of different sub-effects. First, it just increased the regime's ability to regulate and collect revenue on that activity. If you can see it, if you can track it, if it has to be reported and it's regulated, then you can tax it or institute fees. And so the regime actually increased its ability to capture some of the revenue. It didn't completely get rid of the misalignment between local officials in Pyongyang, but it created tighter alignment because more of the revenue was going in at the local level. And so there was less incentive for some of the local officials to collude with economic elites in hiding that revenue and that activity from the center. It also reduced the information asymmetry by making economic activity more legible to state authorities. One important additional effect of that was really that we interpret this as an effort to co-opt this new nouveau riche class or subclass. By offering, let me be clear that it is partial and bounded legitimation of their activity, but at least partly legitimizing some of this activity to avoid it being something that was totally in opposition to the directives of the state, and making it such that you could be a politically loyal citizen and engage in some of this activity and make some money and have a certain level of economic livelihood that you could provide for yourself without having to directly defy the regime's dictates to do it. And so the thinking is that this is aimed at potentially allowing North Korea to avoid the entrepreneurial middle class coalescing into an oppositional force, as we've seen in other authoritarian political systems. That, again, depends on the coexistence of these changes with tighter political control and strong enforcement of that tighter political control. including, for example, the reports of executions for consumption of foreign subversive or foreign media content, which is pretty clear that North Korea regarded as not just a sort of an annoyance or a governance problem, but actually a threat to regime security itself and to the sort of purity of North Korean ideology, which must avoid contamination by foreign ideas and information. The only thing I'll say in closing is that what I've outlined here are the steps that, this is very much a state of play. It's an evolving interaction between the state and society. And as the state puts in regulations, citizens will weigh those and experience those at the local level and experience how they're actually implemented and come up with their own adaptations to work with, and in some cases around, some of these new measures. And so I want to be clear that in outlining the existence of the regime's strategy of market Leninism, I am not in any way suggesting either that it has been successful entirely or that it will be successful indefinitely going forward. Those are separate things, and I want to make clear that the analysis is very much one and not the other. But I hope that gives some sense of how the state's policy framework that it's put out piecemeal and gradually over the course of the last decade has shifted some of the experience in the daily lives of North Koreans, particularly those who are either local officials or who were engaged in black market activity previously, and gives us a starting point for a little bit of discussion and conversation.
My last question, actually. Then you actually talk about the nouveau riche, their emerging and then growing influence in the North Korean regime. I think it's as a authoritarian leader in a one-party or Kim family personalist regime. Kim Jong-un and his ruling clique are probably threatened by this emerging class, because they have money. And at the same time, you're talking about anti-corruption drive to actually control all this type of new emerging class. At the same time, those collaborators from within the conventional traditional elites. And from this perspective, what does the Kim Jong-un regime need to co-opt this nouveau riche further to, I think, is completely within the system and be a loyal supporter of the Kim Jong-un in the next couple of decades? Hard question, I know.
Gosh, there's a lot going on in that question, so let me try to answer it coherently and without rambling, which may be tricky because there are a couple of different parts to that question. First, I think one of the tools that we haven't talked about that is more social is intermarriage. And that for lots of reasons, one way to get the advantages of both political status, which is sort of the old guard and the vested existing political interests in North Korea, and the economic nouveau riche, the benefits of that status, is for families to intermarry. And there have been some reports, some really interesting reports, particularly from people who've left North Korea in the last 5 to 7 years of that phenomenon rising as families sort of and individuals seek to get the benefits of both worlds. So that's not to say that marriage is entirely strategic and sort of instrumental in North Korea. I don't want to dehumanize it in that way by suggesting that's all it is. But we've heard reports that that's a phenomenon that has, it's a non-economic tool by which we've seen local actors try to combine the best of both worlds, so to speak. So I think that's one piece of it. That's obviously not something the regime necessarily is ordering, right? So to your question about what could the regime do more, I think it's going to be a continued combination of sticks and carrots. So one function that the anti-corruption campaigns serve is as a reminder that it's okay to make money, it's okay to prosper if you do it in the way and according to the rules laid out by the regime, and you stay within certain political boundaries. And having that prospect, that promise, that carrot, combined with the stick of, and if you politically step out of line, then there is this potential for a really harsh anti-corruption campaign or investigation to come your way. I think is a fairly powerful combination of stick and carrot.
Good.
That we've seen again, deployed in China, but also heard consistently as a feature of Kim Jong-un's governance as well. So those are the main things that I see to be likely going forward. But again, to say that this is what I think the regime will try to do, every authoritarian regime tries to maximize its own chances of survival and to get the most loyalty and adherence, fidelity from citizens that it can. North Korea is maybe on one end of the spectrum in that regard, but certainly not unique. And I think that that's not to say that these efforts work perfectly. There are, even in a system that aims at totalitarianism, as I think North Korea often has and does, there are still gaps and spaces and the sort of the sphere of state control is still not 100%, and that's what kind of makes trying to understand how these really ambitious policy changes on the part of the state, how they do actually trickle down and impact the daily lives of North Koreans. That's actually part of what makes the process of trying to understand that so fascinating. So I think it's likely to, as I said earlier, that sort of back and forth cat and mouse is likely to continue. But I think the North Korean regime will continue to experiment with those sticks and carrots and try to make sure that whatever market activity occurs can still be disciplined, regulated, and accrued to the state's benefit.
Good. Thank you so much.